So the winners, in a sense, of World War One are the capitalist liberal democracies. They have been shaken, but they had won the war. And there's a saying that nothing succeeds like success. And the meaning is, if you want to have influence, if you want people to respect you and to imitate you, then you should succeed. And that's, in a sense, what the capitalist liberal democracies have done. They have succeeded. They have won the war. So in many ways, it looks like their model is a good model, right? Because they have been successful. They have won. However, we have to stress that they have been severely shaken. Of the country that was the most shaken by this would have to be France, right? So to give you an example, in France, out of every 10 men of working age after the war, 2 had died in the war. So 20% of French men who were of working age were killed in the war. And just kind of let that sink in for a second. One out of every 5 French men that is of working age that was capable of bearing arms in the war is now dead. That's pretty serious stuff, right? The amount of suffering that the French endured is tremendous. One of those 10 men of working age would have survived the war, but is now an invalid because of their wounds, now needs constant care, is not able to go out and work. Rather, they're someone who needs to be taken care of. And of the 10 men of working age immediately after the war, 3 who survived would have been wounded. They will eventually get better, but they have been wounded. So this is a society that has been incredibly marked by war, has suffered a huge amount from this war. Other European countries were also hurt by the war. So there are limits to European recovery, right? Sometimes in the United States, when you think of American history, we focus on how after the war we had the roaring 20s and everything's great. For European countries, it's not like that. They have suffered so much in this war that there are limits to their recovery. So what this means then, though, the United States, we're stronger after the war than we were before. We lost people in the war. I mean, I don't want to take away from the sacrifice made by Americans in this war, but if you look at it in terms of national power, we don't suffer anything like France does, right? We don't suffer anything like they did. So what this means is if European countries are going to become weaker after this war, Britain and France are weaker after this war than they were before the war. United States, nope, we're stronger, both in relative terms because we didn't lose so many people, but also because the war will help our economy to develop. For example, before the war, we were in debt overall to European countries. If you totaled up all the debts that Americans owed to European countries versus how much money they owed us, we owed them more money than they owed us. But after the war, it's reversed. European countries owe the Americans more money than we owe them. So we are incredibly strong after the war. And throughout the 20s, Americans enjoy tremendous economic growth. And this leads to this hope that we have entered an era of unending wealth where we will also enjoy peace. So Americans in the 1920s are becoming incredibly wealthy in comparison to what we had been before, and this leads to this kind of optimism and this hope that not only will we enjoy all these material goods, we will also enjoy peace. But one thing you have probably come to realize through this class, whenever I talk about something really great, my next slide explains how everything then went bad, right? Historians, we tend to be cynical. We tend to be pessimistic. There are reasons why. So what's key is you had this kind of hope among Americans that things were just going to get better and better and better, and that the economy was going to get better and better and better. And there was this overconfidence in the belief that the economy would keep growing, would keep getting even stronger over time. And in particular, there became this American fascination with the stock market, right? This idea that if you invested some money in a stock market, bought a share of a stock, which gives you ownership in a corporation, you would make in a really short amount of time a bunch of money, right? You could buy a stock for $10 and tomorrow it would be $20 and next week would be $50 and you could sell it and you would make a huge amount of money. And everyone thought they could do this and make money. So, and people were even borrowing money to buy stock, right? So you may go to a bank and borrow money to buy a house or to buy a car or something like that, but people were actually borrowing money to buy stock. And there's one American industrialist, and I don't know if the story is true or not, but it gives you a sense of what was happening at the time, is that he was getting his shoes shined by a kid, and the kid started giving him stock advice. And he said, oh my gosh, if the kids are giving me stock advice, I need to get out of the market because the thing's going to explode. And this isn't a class on economics, so I'm not going to go too much deeply into the principles why this happens. But basically, you had all these people buying stock in hopes that it would eventually go really, really high and they would sell it and make a huge amount of money. And for some reason, I don't know why, but there's this kind of magic number you reach where people will say, okay, I've made enough money, it's time to sell the stock. But here's the thing about the stock market, and pretty much anything. Something is only worth as much as someone else is willing to pay you for it. So what happened was, all these people, they thought their stock that they had bought for I'm just going to say $10. They thought they could sell it now for $20. But when it got to that price, though, the problem was a huge number of people thought they were just going to be able to sell it for $20, and no one was interested in buying it for $20. So, I spent $10 on this stock with the idea I could sell it for $20, and now no one wants to buy it. And what happens then is that people will panic. People say, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose even that $10 I invested. I'm going to sell it even for just $5. And that number that I gave you, things were actually much worse. People were selling money, were panicking and selling stocks for pennies on the dollar. So someone, to give you an example, may have bought $1,000 worth of stocks and only have been able to sell it for $100. That's a big problem. But here's what makes it an even bigger problem. There were people, like I said, who went into debt to buy stock. There were people who bought stock with their own money that they could not afford to lose. So this is a big problem. If I borrowed $1,000 to buy stock and I sell that stock for only $100, I'm out $900. And the reason I was borrowing the money in the first place was because I didn't have any money of my own, so I can't pay that back. I'm ruined. I go bankrupt because I can't repay that loan. So we go from this sense of overconfidence that the market will just grow and grow and grow to a sense of despair, a panic that the market is shrinking and I need to sell and sell now, or else I'm going to lose everything. And this panic will spread throughout the world, because I want to emphasize that there was this growing kind of world trade centered on the United States. Right? There was this growing world trade. There was a global market centered on the United States. So when you had a problem in the American market, it spread throughout the world. Right? So this panic is going to spread throughout the world. Now, I need to talk a little bit about how banks work in order to understand the Great Depression. But basically, the way banks works is people put money in a bank. Typically, the bank will pay interest on the money that they have deposited in the bank. Right? You may have a savings account, and the bank pays you some interest. The bank then takes a portion of your money and loans it out to other people at a higher interest rate than what they pay you. And the difference between those interest rates is their profit. Right? That's how banks, in a sense, I mean, this is oversimplification, but that's how banks work. You deposit money, the bank pays you an interest for the money you've deposited, and then they loan out at a higher interest, and their profit comes from the difference. Now, this is in a sense good, right? It's good for everyone gets something out of this. You get money and the interest that's paid you, and a safe place to put your money. The bank makes a profit, and people get access to loans so they can do things like buy houses, buy cars, go to school, that kind of thing. So that's how banks work. Now, the danger, though, is if a bank loans out too much money or has bad loans, it will run out of money and it cannot give you your money back. Right? In this time period, this isn't how it works now because we have FDIC insurance. But in this time period, a bank could actually go out of business. So if a bank ran out of money, it would go out of business. And if you had money deposited in the bank and that bank went out of business, your money's gone in this time period, right? So the good thing, banks, I mean, they're great. They can help you. Like I said, you get money from the interest. They provide a safe place to put your money. But if they go out of business, your money is gone. So here's what happens. Some banks will go out of business because of the bad loans. Some banks will run out of money because they made too many loans that now cannot be paid back because of the stock market crash. Then people will panic. People are like, oh, maybe that bank down the street where I put my money, maybe they're going to go out of business. Maybe I need to go there and withdraw all my money, because if they all go out of business, I will lose my money. And when a lot of people do that, that's called a bank run. So you might have a perfectly healthy bank, a bank that has not made bad loans, a bank that is doing fine, that's turning a profit and is economically sound. But some people are afraid now that that bank might go out of business. And if it goes out of business, they'll lose all their money. So they're going to go and withdraw their money, and then the bank will go out of business. Right? So panic will lead to bank runs, which will drive banks out of business. Now, here's the problem then. Remember, I said that banks perform a useful service because they loan money so that people can buy stuff. Well, that means that, let's say in the past, I want to borrow some money to buy a car. I want to borrow some money to buy a refrigerator or something. I can't do that now because the bank doesn't either is out of business or is afraid to loan out money because it's afraid of a bank run, right? So I cannot borrow money to now buy a refrigerator or something like that, right? Because the bank is either out of business and can't loan me money, or is afraid to loan me money because it's afraid of a bank run. Or I might actually have the money for the refrigerator, but because the economy is going nuts, I don't want to spend that money because I might need it. I don't want to spend my money. I need to hold on to my money. I need to save my money because I'm afraid of what might happen. Well, here's the problem. If I'm not buying refrigerators, if I'm not buying a car, if I'm not buying stuff, and lots of other people aren't buying stuff, demand goes down and people will lose their jobs. If I work at a refrigerator factory and the demand for refrigerators go down, I will lose my job because they don't need me anymore. The problem then is those people now have lost their jobs. They can't buy anything because they lost their jobs. And they can't pay back loans. They may have borrowed money to buy something because they had a job and they thought they could pay it back. But now they've lost their job. They can't They can't repay their loans. So this causes another cycle of banks going out of business because they've made bad loans or panics and so forth. So banks will, again, like I said, they're in a difficult situation. So they will stop or reduce loans even further, or they'll go out of business. And demand goes down even more now because people can't borrow, even more money now can't borrow money to buy stuff. So this is a vicious cycle. People are either are afraid to spend money, they're afraid to loan money. That means that people are not able to buy stuff or are unwilling to buy stuff. That leads to a decrease in demand. If demand decreases, people lose their jobs because people don't want the stuff that they made, and that means demand goes down even more. So it's this terrible, vicious cycle. So what effects does this have? Well, again, we're in an integrated world economy. This affects everyone, right? This affects everyone, not just the United States, the entire world. And to give you a sense of this, I'm going to focus on Europe and the United States because it's key to understanding how World War II happens. Unemployment in the United States reached 25%. Unemployment in Britain reached 25%. Unemployment in Germany reached 40%. 40%. 4 out of every 10 Germans who wanted to work could not find a job. And you can see how on this graph on the right, how world trade is going to plummet, right? World trade is going to drop, right, by about by 2/3 between 1929 and 1933. It's going to only be 1/3 of what had been before. So imagine that you're working for a company that makes a lot of money trading internationally, right? You work for a company that sells a lot of goods internationally. Well, thanks to this Great Depression, thanks to these economic difficulties, their overseas sales just went down by 2/3. They're going to cut workers and employment's going to go up. So the key thing is we had this integrated world economy that affects everyone. You're going to have huge unemployment rates because people, there's not that demand is no longer there. No one seems to have any money. And that's going to lead to a volatile political situation. And it's important to note that this is what opens the way for the Nazis to take power, is this high German unemployment. And you might say, well, at least if you're a farmer, you're safe, right? I mean, at least you can eat. And nope, you can't. Agricultural prices will also tumble. So for example, wheat will drop to a third of its original price. Well, imagine that you're a wheat farmer and you had been surviving on $30,000 a year. I'm just making up numbers. And now all of a sudden you're expected to survive on $10,000 a year, right? Think about that. Imagine if you as a student suddenly found that you only had a third as much money as you used to. You used to have $1,000 a month to survive, to pay your bills. Now you only have $300 a month. And the problem was, farmers, they have to buy other things in order to survive. This really hurts them because their prices of what they're producing have gone down by 2/3. It's only 1/3 of what it used to be. Their income is only 1/3 of what it used to be. And the problem is that a lot of farmers borrowed money to buy tractors and other things like that, right? Farmers are always in debt. I'm from a northern Indiana farm family, or that's where my dad is from, I should say. So I'm well familiar with this. Farmers are always in debt. They're always having to borrow money, and they use their land as collateral. So imagine this. You're a farmer. You assume that wheat prices were going to be, we'll just say, $10 a bushel, and they dropped to $3 a bushel, and that's bad enough. But what's really bad is you just bought a fancy new tractor, and you budgeted for that based on the idea you were continuing to make $10 a bushel on wheat. And you put up your land as collateral, so you're not going to be able to pay not only are you not be able to pay the loan on that tractor, you're eventually going to lose your land and the tractor. Right? I mean, I'm oversimplifying the things a bit, but the key thing is farmers also are going to take a huge economic hit. Many of them were already in debt. They can't pay back their loans, so they're going to lose their farms. And like I said, they had borrowed money in part to mechanize. And so they're also going to suffer, right? Workers will lose their jobs. Farmers will lose their farms. We have huge unemployment. Now, of course, people did respond to the situation. They tried to figure out what can we do in order to help the economy get back on its feet again, help people get jobs again. The problem they faced, though, was that this was a new kind of economy. It was a global economy in which the old ideas did not work. So in the past, when you were in situations like this, you would reduce wages. The idea being that if workers get less money, you can still employ a fairly decent number of workers, and so unemployment would not go up so high. So the basic idea was that everyone takes a cut so more people can keep their jobs. In the end, though, in this case, it doesn't really do much good. Demand will still stay very low. Another idea is to cut government spending. Right? The idea of government spending is that it requires taxes. Why would you try and make people pay taxes when they don't have a job, they don't have enough money? As the saying goes, you can't get blood from a stone. So let's just cut government spending so people won't have to pay such high taxes. And of course, people appreciate that. It gives people relief, but it doesn't necessarily help. And we'll see that actually sometimes government spending does help. Another thing that people would do is raise tariffs on foreign goods to protect workers. So, for example, we've talked about tariffs before. Remember, a tariff is a tax on an import. So, for example, if we have all these cheap foreign goods coming into our country, people will buy them instead of buying domestic goods. And the problem is, if people are buying foreign goods instead of domestic goods, foreign workers will have jobs, but American workers will not. So let's raise tariffs on foreign goods, right? So let's say that there's a lot of foreign refrigerators coming into the United States, all right, because they're cheaper than American refrigerators. So let's put a tariff on those refrigerators coming into the United States so that we can make sure that they will be more expensive than American refrigerators and people will buy American refrigerators, right? That's the basic idea of a tariff in this case, right? You put a tax on imports in order to protect your domestic workers. Now, Americans will buy American refrigerators. But let's say that we're in a situation with the United States and Japan, and the United States decides that it's going to put a tax on Japanese clothing. Japanese are making very cheap textiles, very cheap clothing, and selling it to the Americans. So what we will do then is we'll put a tax on Japanese clothing so that American clothing will be cheaper and Americans will buy that. Sounds like a good idea, but guess what? The Japanese will say, oh, that's the game you want to play. Well, now we're going to put taxes, tariffs on American agricultural goods. We're going to put tariffs on American wheat, or we're going to put tariffs on American cars. So now we have a tariff war, right, where the Americans are putting tariffs on Japanese goods and the Japanese are putting tariffs on American goods. And the end of it is it doesn't really help anyone, right? And the reason for that is that the new wealth of this growing economy that was really developing in the 1920s was based largely on international trade. So taking actions like tariff wars, putting tariffs on imported goods, reduces international trade. And so in the long run, it's not actually going to help anyone, right? It's not going to make it so that people are able to increase demand and people can get their jobs back. So because a lot of the wealth that had been created before the Depression was based on international trade, trying to restore the economy by having tariffs isn't going to help, because their taxes on imported goods reduce international trade. So the most significant thing I want you to understand is, because this situation was new, people initially were not sure exactly what to do about it. They tried the old ideas, but because the economy was different, the old ideas that had worked in the past are not working in the present. Since the old ideas are not working, there will be room to try new ideas. And one of the most important thinkers that has influenced government policy to this day, that you have likely never heard of, is a British Englishman named John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes. I cannot, in a sense, overemphasize how important this person is. For example, when President Obama, back after the housing crisis, issued a stimulus package, it was based on the thought of John Maynard Keynes, who by that time had been dead for about almost 6 decades. And even though it's been 60 years since this guy has passed away, our economic thinking is still very much based on his ideas. And he was really good at coming up with ideas, particularly with snappy phrases to explain his ideas. And one thing he was frustrated at was that some people said, well, there's really not much we can do about the economy. We should just sit back and just let it run. And in the long run, the economy will fix itself. And Keynes's response was, in the long run, we are all dead. Meaning that if we don't do something now, right, nothing is going to change. The situation is going to continue being bad. We need to do something. So Keynes is important in part because he represents just the faith, the idea that governments can do something about the economy. This may sound strange, but remember, Adam Smith effectively argued that governments should stay out of the economy for the most part. Right? Adam Smith took this view that, things like price fixing and most government things that the government might do actually interfered with the economy and caused it to run against its natural law. Keynes says, you know what? The economy is different, it's complex, and the government can, if it follows correct economic principles, correct economic laws, can actually make the situation better. Another one of his snappy kind of phrases is he talked about the paradox of thrift, right? When you think about it this way, right? If someone starts to spend money irresponsibly, for example, and they don't have it, you've got a person who's borrowing lots of money with credit cards and just spending money on stuff they don't need, we would say that that is irresponsible. On the other hand, if we have someone who is carefully saving money for their retirement, to save for a good down payment on a house so they don't have to have such a long mortgage and so forth, we would call that person thrifty and we would praise them. Now, the problem that Keynes is trying to point out with this idea of the paradox of thrift is that the behavior of individuals that might be praiseworthy may not actually be good for the economy, and certainly such behavior is not good for the government. So our instinct when the economic situation is bad is to save money, right? I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I may lose my job tomorrow, so I don't want to spend money. I want to save it. The paradox of thrift, however, is that while such behavior is rational, when it happens on a large scale, it can seriously impact the economy. Because remember, if no one wants to spend money, if everyone just saves money, demand goes down and no one has a job. So that's what he calls the paradox of thrift. We need to figure out, even though it's in a sense it's responsible, it makes sense to save money, we need to figure out a way to get people to spend money. We need to stimulate demand and increase confidence so that people will have the money that they need to buy stuff and will have the confidence to buy stuff. We need to convince people that the economy is good enough that they can trust that tomorrow they will have a job so that they will be willing to spend money, right? So this is we're trying to restore consumer confidence so people will spend money so that will stimulate demand. And that means that people will get jobs because now you'll have people buying refrigerators and cars and tractors and everything. And what's really striking is that Keynes argued that even though, and he's thinking again of the paradox of thrift, even though it feels natural that when a government is facing a difficult economic situation that it should cut taxes and reduce spending, actually that's a bad idea. Keynes argued that in such a difficult economic situation, governments should spend money even if they have to borrow money. Government should spend more when there's a bad economic situation, not less, even if they have to borrow. And you may ask yourself, well, wait a second, where are the governments going to get money? There are people that have money. There are banks that have money, but they're scared to lend it out because they're afraid that the people won't be able to pay it back and the bank may go out of business. But generally, governments have better credit. So governments can borrow this money, right? Banks might be afraid to borrow or to loan the money to just your average everyday person, but they are willing to loan it to the government. So since governments have better credit, they can borrow the money and then engage in spending. This is deficit spending because they're not doing this from money that they raise from taxes, but from money that they borrowed. But the idea is that this will government spending will create demand, which leads to employment and hope and confidence, and that will break the vicious cycle. Once people start working again, once they have money in their pockets, once they have hope in the future that they will keep their jobs, they will start spending money. And then that will lead to increased demand, which will lead other people to get jobs making stuff, and the cycle will just continue because now you've got an unemployed person employed, they can start buying stuff too, right? This is his idea for how you overcome this vicious cycle. And to give you a concrete example, and I'll talk more about how this happens, the Tennessee Valley Authority is an example of this, right? The Tennessee Valley Authority was a U.S. government institution that was dedicated to helping bring infrastructure improvements to the Tennessee River Valley. And Tennessee was, and still to a certain extent, is a relatively poor state, so they were particularly hard hit by the economic problems. And the Tennessee Valley Authority sought to do things like build hydroelectric dams. So they would come into Tennessee, and this is a government program, so the government has money. It's borrowed money, or however it's got tax money, borrowing money, it's got money. It's going to help build dams in Tennessee. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it means jobs. They have to hire engineers, for example, to design the dams. They have to hire construction workers to build the dams. A lot of those construction workers, of course, will come from Tennessee, an area hard hit by the Depression. And once they finish building the dam, they will have electricity, right? This dam will also make electricity, will generate electricity through the flow of the river. So the idea here is now all these Tennessee people and other people who didn't have jobs now have jobs. They're making money from the government, right? They've got this job. They will spend money. They will buy stuff. That they have demands and they have a job, so they're willing to buy stuff. That will stimulate the economy because now that there's demand, people will start opening up businesses. People will start opening up factories again to meet the demands of these people, to make stuff for them. And of course, now they have electricity, cheap electricity that can help them to expand the economy even further. So this is the idea of deficit spending, right? In this difficult economic circumstance, the U.S. government, rather than saying, oh, we're not going to buy it, we don't want to spend money. Yes, we're going to spend money. We're going to build this dam. This will give employment to people, stimulate demand, and help bring economic recovery. Now, before we continue, it's interesting that economics is often referred to as the dismal science. It's more depressing in a sense, I guess, than history. And John Maynard Keynes, I don't want you to get the impression that this was a boring person. He certainly wasn't. And I just think it's interesting to get to know the person as a person beyond just their ideas. One thing I think is very interesting about John Maynard Keynes, as a economist, he married a ballerina. That woman on the left is his wife, and she was a professional ballerina. And they got married, an economist and a ballerina. And there you can see on the right where she's teaching him some moves. So there you go. They may call this the dismal science of economics, but John Maynard Keynes was certainly not a dismal person. So this leads to what we call managed capitalism. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known affectionately in this time period as FDR, is going to follow Keynes. Right? He will become president of the United States and will follow Keynes' advice and do things like the Tennessee Valley Authority. So he will follow this idea of using government spending to bring economic recovery and stability. Now, this means, in a sense, the rejection of pure capitalism, something more like Adam Smith's views, where the government should sit back and let the economy run itself, in favor of managed capitalism, in which some government intervention into a free market economy is acceptable. Right? And we've accepted this idea. And like I said, whenever there's an economic problem in the United States, we tend to follow Keynes. And what this means is this is going to allow liberal democracies that are able to do this, like the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, to survive until World War II. And it's really World War II that brings these countries, especially the United States, out of the Depression. We have not completely recovered by the time of World War II. It's just that following the Keynesian kind of economic recovery model, we were able to do enough that we could survive, that our capitalist liberal democracy was able to survive and would not be overthrown. However, Germany, Italy, and Japan, those democracies will either be overthrown or, in the case of Japan, subverted, in part because they're not able to successfully implement these ideas, and they will all fall. And I just want to stress, this is where economic history can be so important. The Great Depression is something... or rather, how a government reacts to the Great Depression and how successful they are helps determine what side they were going to be on World War II. Liberal democracies that managed to survive the Great Depression end up on one side, the Allied sides, but those democracies that were not able to deal with it, Germany, Italy, and Japan, end up on the Axis side. And I think that's really fascinating. Now, I have to end noting something that I think is two things rather, that I think are very interesting. First of all, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was immensely popular among poor people in the United States, right? He was seen as their true friend, as their major supporter, and they continuously elected him. I mean, one thing about FDR, he was elected to the presidency 4 times, and he's the reason why now we have a term limit. You can't be president more than twice. So he was a very popular person. But what I think is fascinating is for someone who was considered a friend of the poor, he was extraordinarily wealthy. He was born into wealth. And if you remember from that previous slide, you saw him there with his cigarette holder and sitting in a fancy automobile. Here you can see him on his, I believe, second martini, maybe his third, right? He's smoking, again, with a cigarette holder. He doesn't want to hold his cigarettes directly. That would make his hands dirty. He wants to use a cigarette holder. And I just think it's fascinating that this guy became considered the friend of the poor. And he really was. But the guy himself was fabulously wealthy, and he was born into fabulous wealth, and he certainly enjoyed living the high life. Now, one thing that's also, just to give you a sense of how deep this runs, his name was very long, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and people nicknamed him FDR. You may have noticed something, that my name is Franklin Rausch. I'm Dr. Franklin Rausch. My middle name is David, so my initials are also FDR. That was not an accident. My grandfather was Francis Charles Rausch. He was a northern Indiana farmer. So he was a friend of FDR. He considered FDR to be the farmer's friend, was someone who was helping him out. So he named my father Francis David Rausch, right? So my grandfather was Francis Charles Rausch. He wanted to honor FDR and keep the family name, so he named my father Francis David Rausch. So they would both have the name Francis, but then they would also have the D, Delano or David, so that they would have a total of FDR. Then, to make things, of course, interesting, was my dad decided that was a good tradition to continue, but he hated the name of Francis. My father does not go by Francis, he goes by David. So he named me Franklin David Rausch. Franklin, however, is a terrible name. Do not inflict it on your children. It is awful. You do not want that name. Please don't do that to your kids. So I named, my wife and I named our first son David. right? So we kept the David, so we've kind of lost that tradition. But I just wanted to point out that's how deeply popular FDR was. You've got people naming their kids after the guy. And that tradition continued in history.